Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule with a short notice to be here this afternoon or this evening. I also want to thank CDI, the Canadians for Democracy in Iran, for helping us to organize this event. So thank you very much for their support and also their assistance in getting this putting this event together. I also want to thank a number of volunteers who behind the scenes help us to get this event organized in a very short time. So thank you, everyone. To begin, we would like to start with the national anthems. So please rise for the Iranian and Canadian national anthem. Thank you.
Our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true. Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we rise, the true north, strong and free, from far and wide.
Canada, stand on guard for thee. God, keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Thank you. Well, thank you very much and خیلی ممنون که همه سرود کانادا خوب بلد بودن و همینطور سرود ایران یادمون نرفت هیچ کدوم. Thank you very much. Well, I want to begin by thanking Dr. Javaid Rehman for taking the time to be here this afternoon, this evening with us, traveling from the UK. I have been honored to have the opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our special guest, Professor Javaid Rehman. Dr. Rehman is a legal scholar and a professor of law at Brunel University, London. Professor Rehman was the Dean of Brunel Law School and the founding director of the Center for Security, Media, and Human Rights at Brunel. In July 2018, Professor Rehman was elected as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Professor Rehman has a distinguished academic career with profound achievements. He has over 180 publications, including 20 books on topics such as Islamic State practices, international law and the threat from terrorism, and the terrorism and international law. Professor Rehman was born in Faisalabad, Punjab province, Pakistan, and is a graduate of the prestigious Government College University in Lahore, Pakistan, and the Reading and the Hull Universities in the UK. Towards the end of his 6-year tenure as the UNSR, he delivered an outstanding report on human rights issues, the rule of law, justice, and accountability in Iran. Today, Professor Rehman makes the first public discussion of his findings outside of the UN Human Rights Council. It is with particular significance to have this discussion here in Toronto in the aftermath of the recent Canadian government's action placing the IRGC on the list of terrorist organizations. Professor Rehman's powerful report, a landmark in its field, uses the voices of survivors to skillfully demonstrate the enduring legacy of the 1980s atrocities, crimes in Iran. It connects these past horrors to the present struggle of the women life freedom movement while grounding its arguments in international law and standards. The report acknowledges the lack of domestic recourse for justice in Iran. It emphasizes the importance of international accountability for these atrocity crimes. In short, his report details grave human rights abuses in the Islamic Republic of Iran during the 1980s, particularly in 1981 to 1982, and indeed in 1988. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rehman to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair. Thank you so much for this generous introduction. I'm honored and I'm humbled to be here with you this evening. It's a great honor and a great privilege to meeting some of our old friends, but also making new friends. And as I end my 6 years of the mandate, my tenure, my personal tenure as a special rapporteur on Iran, it brings me great memories, and I feel really privileged to have been serving such an amazing country and such an amazing people who have been and who continue to be subjugated by an oppressive regime. And as our chair mentioned, I have put in a lot of effort to produce a landmark report. Such a report has never been written or published by any of the UN mechanisms, and therefore I would urge you to read that report. That report has been submitted to the United Nations, and I have been told authoritatively that it will be on my web page on the 17th of July. So please hold back until that time. But I think that's a great moment, as was just mentioned, that outside of the United Nations, this is the first time that I'm going to summarize to you my key findings of what is the content of this report. So, as you know, that since 1979, the Islamic Revolution, there have been very serious violations of human rights. And what my report does is it looks at the first decade since 1979 as to the violations of human rights. And I have termed these violations as atrocity crimes. And some of you may be aware of the meaning of atrocity crimes in international law, but I have explained that in much more detail in my report, concentrating on two key elements. One is the crimes against humanity, which form part of the atrocity crimes, and I've looked at those atrocity crimes against humanity in a lot more detail in relation to the violations that took place in the first 10 years of the establishment of the Islamic Republic. And I've also, more interestingly and controversially, looked at the crime of genocide and its applicability to the various groups and the various communities who were affected during the first 10 years. So that's a really important original element which I think you need to look and understand in more detail. So as I say, this report contains a very comprehensive and detailed findings that are a work of my mandate, and I'm in particular looking at atrocity crimes of crimes against humanity that took place in the 10 years, but more specifically during 1981 and 82, and as was mentioned in 1988. Now, the interesting element for me when I was writing this report was that we haven't really addressed adequately what happened after 1979, and in particular the crimes that were committed in 1981 and 82, because thousands of people were extrajudicially, summarily and arbitrarily killed at the behest of the state. And that I have investigated in a lot of depth, right? So in the elaboration of atrocity crimes, I have detailed the summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions of thousands of arbitrarily imprisoned political opponents, amounting to what I say are crimes against humanity of murder and extermination. There is also a detailed consideration of the crimes against humanity of torture, of persecution, and enforced disappearances and other inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering and serious injuries to the bodies and to the mental and physical health of the political prisoners. And here I'm looking at all of the 10 years, but in particular 1981, 82, and of course 1988. So the executions that took place also included those of women. Some of them were reportedly raped before their executions, and the executions also contained a very large number of children, minors, by which I mean people who were below the age of 18 when they were arrested, and many of them indeed were executed when they were children. In its specific examination of crimes against humanity, I have analyzed the sexual and gender-based crimes against women and girls, as well as the persecution of religious, ethnic, and linguistic minorities during the first decade of the establishment of the Islamic Republic in 1979. And what I was telling some colleagues here, that in my findings, I found that certain minorities, in particular the Baha'is, were targeted with genocidal intent. And I think that is a very important element that we have to recognize, that when a regime is targeting a certain religious minority with the intent of exterminating it, you see, torturing people, eliminating its leadership. That has to be, in my judgment, recognized as the crime of genocide. Because we have to understand the legal definition, but also the mindset of those who were using the brutal arm of the state to exterminate a minority. And that's what I've addressed in that report. So as I have noted, and as I've reported the atrocity crimes, they represent the commission of the worst and most egregious human rights abuses of our living memory. And these are indeed the most egregious human rights abuses that we have seen anywhere in the world, particularly having regard to no accountability whatsoever. I mean, you can look at some of the reports. In particular, I would mention Jeffrey Robertson's report. Some of you may have come across that. And that highlights and compares it to some of the atrocities that were committed, let's say, during the Second World War and subsequently. And what happened in, for example, during the 1988 massacre just stands out as the most egregious example of large-scale arbitrary mass executions. And yet there has been a complete impunity. I mean, you know Ibrahim Raisi was involved in that. You know, Pur Mohammadi has acknowledged his role, and yet these people have been allowed to have the highest positions in the state. And you know what happened to Hamid Nouri. He was convicted, and yet he was allowed to escape justice. And regrettably, state diplomacy and hostage diplomacy yet again prevailed to deny justice to the millions of people of Iran. So what I have documented is that there were worst and most egregious abuses in our living memory, whereby high-ranking state officials connived, conspired, and actively engaged to plan, order, and commit crimes against humanity and genocide against nationals of their own country. Notwithstanding the availability of overwhelming available evidence, to this day, those with criminal responsibility for these grave and most serious violations of human rights and crimes under international law remain in power and control. And I've just given you some of the examples. Yeah? The international community, regrettably, has been unwilling or unable to hold these individuals accountable. Yeah? Indeed, many of these individuals who were implicated in these atrocity crimes, as I said, continue to enjoy the official governmental privileges and impunity from international justice and accountability. In my interviews and in my interaction with the survivors and witnesses, and when you will see the report, I interviewed a minimum of 80 individuals, victims, survivors, and their families. And in fact, throughout the 6 years, I have interviewed dozens of these individuals. Now, the story of these individuals is really one of immense grief and pain. These people remain immeasurably in pain and in grief, and an undeniable victimhood persists and presents a living testimony to these atrocities. As survivors have mentioned in their testimonies in my report, they are all faced with the mental and psychological trauma on a perpetual basis as they search for dignified, respectful, and humane closure to their daily suffering and pain. In innumerable cases, families of those forcibly disappeared continue to search for their loved ones as the authorities persist in violating their rights. The victims and survivors look towards the United Nations and members of the international community for truth, justice, and accountability. So this has been a really challenging and difficult report for me to write, because I met survivors, I met victims, I met families of those who have been forcibly disappeared, and they don't know what happened to their loved ones, you see. Thousands of people in the 1988 massacre were arbitrarily, extrajudicially killed, and then their bodies were thrown or dumped in mass graves. And they are now forcibly disappeared, which is a continuing crime in international law. It is not historic. People who have lost their loved ones, they don't know the fate, and they are now the victims, which international community must take responsibility and say that these crimes are continuing and the perpetrators must be held accountable. And I will come to the point about accountability in a minute, but the point I want to emphasize is that the crimes are not historic. They are crimes of today, particularly when you're talking about the crime of enforced disappearance. That is a crime which the victims and their families are suffering as today, because there is no proof. The state has not given a proof that these people were even executed. They are just disappeared. Now, you might ask, and some people may say, okay, so why and in fact, many people and many states have also questioned me, and they said, why on the face of it you are, opening a challenging scenario, and, it all happened, 45 years or many years ago. So why am I now talking about this? But I tell you one thing, that this is not historic. Firstly, because I've just said that victims are still suffering. There is enforced disappearance, which is a crime which continues as of now and today. But secondly, when I was analyzing these 10 years in more detail, what I found was, and when I looked at the prism of this first decade of the revolution of 1979 to 1988, I found that the current day egregious crimes that are being committed in Iran, for example, the Women Life Freedom Movement, the protest movement, is actually connected to what was happening post-1979. And why do I say that? And I think you can very well imagine that. Because the atrocities that were committed in 1979 and in early 1980s, for example, the enforcement of the compulsory hijab, it does not come from 2022, it comes from 1980, when the Supreme Leader Khomeini forced it upon women. There were women out in the streets of the country. They were challenging the compulsory hijab. And yet, it was at that time, it became a state ideology to repress women and to brutalize them. And that state ideology has continued ever since. So it is not new, tragic as it is, that we find that women are being repressed and their right to freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief is repressed by the regime. Also, if you look at the various arbitrary and discriminatory provisions of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, you will instantly notice that the Constitution is from 1979. So all of the provisions which are arbitrary to this day actually derive from that time. So we should not be surprised that we go back always to 1979. There are many concepts, including, for example, the concept of the role of the Supreme Leader, the concept of Vilayat-e-Faqih is embedded in 1979. The denial of constitutionalism, the denial of rule of law, the denial of separation of powers is not from this time alone. It is connected intimately to 1979 and what happened at that time. If you look at the executions, to which I will briefly point out, executions of political prisoners, execution of protesters. How and why they are executed? Because they are charged with offenses which were created in the early 1980s. So if you look at the offense whereby a number of protesters in the 22 movement were executed, the offense of Muharabe, waging war against God, it came from that time, from what Imam Khomeini ordered, you see. If you look at the offense of Saad fil Earth, spreading corruption on earth, it is a product of that mindset. These offenses are so vague and arbitrary that this is a catch-all kind of offenses whereby anyone who protests against the regime could simply be charged and then executed. And that's what we have seen in post-2022 protests, but also after the 2019 protests and offenses that people were charged with, and going back to 2009 and so on and so forth. Again, another disturbing element which has been my key concern is the perpetual execution of those who are arrested as children. So again, you have to look back as to when this concept started. And you will find that this was the product of 1979 and its subsequent penal code, which authorizes and justifies the continued execution of children. And then there are many other institutional structures through which human rights violations are weaponized and instrumentalized, including, for example, through the use of the Islamic revolutionary courts. They were a product of that time. They were meant to, what we have heard, to dispense revolutionary justice. But that revolutionary justice means violations of all sorts of rights of individuals. So, for example, there is no right for the defendant to have a fair trial. The presumption of innocence does not exist. The right to access a lawyer does not exist in these courts and indeed in other courts as well. So the revolutionary courts have thrived since 1979, and they are actually the basis of most of the execution as of today. So these, all of these institutions were conceptualized, devised, and implemented through the period of investigation, which I've just said, the 10 years from 1979. Now, what are my key recommendations? Because that's quite an important element. So what I have done is I have recommended to the international community and to individual members to take concrete steps to end the continuing impunity within the Islamic Republic of Iran, ensuring accountability, truth, justice, and reparations. I have called upon the international community to establish, that's one of my specific recommendations, to establish an international investigative and accountability mechanism to conduct prompt, impartial, thorough, and transparent investigations into the crimes under international law, as I've stated in my report, and together consolidate and preserve evidence with a view towards future criminal prosecutions of all perpetrators of these crimes. More specifically, I have proposed to the international community to have an accountability mechanism which must investigate the atrocity crimes committed during 1981 to 1982 and in 1988 against thousands of political opponents of the authorities, in particular their mass, summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions amounting to the crimes against humanity of murder and extermination, and the continued concealment of the fate of thousands of political opponents and the whereabouts of their remains, which, as I've just said, amounts to the crime against humanity of enforced disappearance. Enforced disappearance is a continuing crime under international law as long as the perpetrators continue to conceal the fate of the disappeared person and the facts remain unclarified. Additionally, the proposed mechanism must investigate the crimes against humanity of specific crimes such as the crime of torture, persecution, enforced disappearances, and other inhumane acts causing great suffering, serious injuries to the bodies and to the mental and physical health of the political prisoners, as well as the crime of genocide. The international accountability mechanism must also conduct prompt and transparent investigations into the pattern of sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by the authorities against women and girls, including cases of reported rape, as well as the repression, persecution, and summary and arbitrary and extrajudicial executions of ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities during the first decade of the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, what I found intriguing was that in addition to the religious minorities such as the Baha'is, there were also an attempt to exterminate ethnic and linguistic groups, which are also religious minorities, such as the Kurdish people. So immediately after 1979 revolution, there was an attempt by the supreme leader to kill dozens of Kurdish nationalists and Kurdish political parties and the political activists, which has not received due attention. But it is a really significant aspect of how and why Kurds have historically been repressed in Iran. Similar repression we see in the case of Balochis and other minorities, like for example the Ahwazi Arabs. So all of these aspects really need to be followed up and looked at as to what the Islamic Republic has done immediately after the 1979 revolution. So in addition to establishing an international accountability mechanism, I have called upon the international community to require the Iranian authorities to, amongst other things, establish fully the truth regarding the mass enforced disappearances, extrajudicial arbitrary and summary executions, and the genocide, which in my view was committed in the 1980s, and particularly during 1981, 82, and in 1988. And to provide fully, in accordance with international law, reparations and all appropriate remedies to the victims, survivors, as well as to the families of those who were tortured, executed, or forcibly disappeared. Given the serious structural obstacles making the judicial system of Islamic Republic of Iran unable, unwilling, and unavailable to investigate crimes under international law or other human rights violations committed by state agents, I have urged the international community, and in particular individual states, to exercise what we call it as universal jurisdiction or other extraterritorial jurisdiction in relation to crimes under international law, and to conduct investigations, criminal investigations, identifying those suspected of responsibility, including the commanders and other superiors, and issuing, where there's sufficient admissible evidence, international arrest warrants. So that is a brief summary of my, my overview of the crimes that were committed, namely crimes against humanity and genocide. And I've looked at the situation of what I say vulnerable communities, in particular the targeting and the reported rapes of women and girls in prisons, and also targeting of religious minorities, in particular the Baha'is, which I've called the intent to be genocidal. And also I have moved on and I have made some specific recommendations, and I hope that there will be support from the international community, and in particular from the Canadian government, to my recommendations and my proposals for action. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rehman, for your illuminating presentation this evening. And also, on behalf of the Iranian community, in particular on behalf of the audience here, I thank you for your all efforts, long-time efforts on human rights issues, and bringing those atrocities of the Iranian regime over the years, over the past 45 years, since the moment this regime took the office in Tehran, and they started killing people at the rooftop of Alavi School, where Khomeini resided at that time. And they started basically by massacring of the Iranian army generals, from field marshals down to private soldiers. many of them, and then of course they continued this massacre until as we speak today. So thank you very much for bringing this to the attention of the world community, and I hope that the world community, particularly the United Nations and the superpowers of the world, the main powers of the world, they recognizes the significance and the importance of what has been going on in Iran by this regime and the threat they are making towards international peace. Not, of course, for the Iranian people at the first stage, but to the Middle East and also the international peace and stability. So thank you very much again. And I would like to invite Mr. Afshinjam to come to the podium to help me to make a presentation to you on behalf of the Iranian community of Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Of course. Thank you. It's very kind of you. Thank you. Oh, wow, that's so generous of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you.